Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Gross, an extension educator in Central Michigan, and I'd like to welcome everyone to virtual breakfast this morning. This is the last breakfast of the season, so we're happy to have everyone here, and we're happy to have Dr. Christy Sprague with us this morning. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and welcome Dr. Christy Sprague. Good morning.
Good. Well, good morning, everyone. Today, I'd kind of like to talk a little bit about what we might be able to do this fall when it comes to weed management. I think, like Paul, I was one of the first virtual breakfasts, so I think we're going to ended up talking a little bit about weed management and some of the different things that we can see. So as we're driving around many fields, we can see that we've got some soybeans that look pretty clean, but we also have some fields that have some weed escapes. And I would say this year, some of the ones that we've really had issues with are some late season velvet leaf that have come up, some lamb's quarters that were maybe a little bit tougher to control, particularly because of some of the dry weather that we had in areas around the state about that time that some of those post-emergence herbicides were made, both ragweed species, and then kind of our more issues that we see each year with some of our herbicide-resistant weeds like horseweed or mare's tail, both palmer amaranth and water hemp. Here are just a few pictures of some different fields where we can see some weed escapes. Obviously, these are some that have had a lot more issues than just a few late season weeds coming in, but maybe not necessarily having the right herbicide program to manage the particular weeds that are out there. And I just want to point out in the lower right-hand corner, you can see a field where there's some common cockleburr, and that's a weed that's kind of having a resurgence, one of those ones that we used to deal with in the past, and it's really starting to come up as a problem a little bit more. And so that's something we're going to have to keep an eye on. So what are some of the things that can be done at this time of year? Well, right now we're obviously too late for some of our in-season herbicide applications. But what we can really do is kind of plan for the future and scout for some of those different weed escapes that might be out there. And really what we can do is evaluate how effective our program was this year. And, usually it's pretty easy to kind of do some of that scouting in soybean fields. But as you're out there harvesting your corn this year, kind of keep note of where you might have some of those weed problems and think about how you can manage those the following year. The other thing is, at this point, we can definitely identify where there are some new weeds in some of the fields. And I would say probably this year, one of the things that I have seen is there are a lot more fields where water hemp has become more of an issue. So some newer areas, newer fields. So that's going to be something that we're going to concentrate on as far as this winter, talking about what are some of the better programs to make sure that we're managing water hemp. And again, one of the biggest challenges with some of these weeds, whether it's water hemp or palmer amaranth or mare's tail, or in some cases, some of the ragweed species, are some of those resistance issues. And Dr. Aaron Hill did a great job last week talking about testing for herbicide resistance. So as you're going and looking for some of those weed escapes, if you feel that you have some resistance issues, this might be a good time to actually test for resistance. And again, Aaron did a fantastic job talking about how to do that, how to collect it, but just keep that in mind. And really some of the ones that we really need to be thinking about is particularly the water hemp, because I know most of the water hemp that we have is glyphosate resistance and also resistant to the ALS herbicides, but we're also seeing in a few fields some resistance to what we would consider the group 14 or PPO inhibitors. So those are things like Cobra and Flexstar. And it would be a really good idea if we've got water hemp showing up to find out if we have that resistance issue in some of those fields, because that's going to definitely change how we might manage it in the future. So what else can be done? So many times when we do see weed escapes, it might be just a small patch. So for example, this is a field that was down in Southwest Michigan that we saw several years ago that had some palmer amaranth that had some escapes. And if you have a small patch like that, and particularly some of the pigweed species, they don't necessarily shed their seed. They don't shatter like some of the other species. So if you could actually just go out there and for some of those small patches, get those weeds out of the field, that's going to really help lower those populations, and definitely making sure that you don't get that going through the combine. Also, where we have some new weed issues, especially some of the resistant weeds, if it's a pocket somewhere, you may want to just harvest around that weedy area so you're not getting that seed into your combine. Or if you're going to harvest that field, try to harvest that area last, because then you can try to do your best in making sure that that combine's cleaned out and that you're not spreading that those weed seeds from one field to the next. Now, we also have the option of using some of these different harvest aids, and we call these some of our pre-harvest herbicide treatments. And I'm going to mention a little bit in soybeans. One of the things I do want to say is that a lot of times these harvest aids aren't necessarily commonly used in soybeans, but I will mention them and maybe talk a little bit about some of the pluses and minuses. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some of those harvest aids in dry beans, because that is definitely an area where we get the most use. So in soybeans, we do have some different options that we can use. Obviously, glyphosate is one of those products that we can use as a harvest aid. And you can see here some of the different harvest aids that we do have. We have the pre-harvest intervals for each one of those applications. So for example, with glyphosate, in a Roundup Ready soybean, you can use 3/4 of a pound of glyphosate to help desiccate some of those weeds to maybe, for example, something like lamb's quarter, but you would have to wait 14 days from that time of application up till the time of harvest. If they're non-Roundup Ready beans, it's a 7-day interval, and you could actually go up to a much higher rate of 3.6 pounds per acid equivalent per acre. Obviously, gramoxone is another herbicide that we can use. The one thing that's a little bit different between soybeans and dry beans is gramoxone use rates in soybeans are much lower. So maybe not as effective if you're a dry bean grower. You kind of know what you get with gramoxone, but you're kind of looking at a 2/3 of the rate that we normally use. So it may not be as effective as what you might see in with dry beans. AIM's another herbicide. You can also use some lower rates of clarity. That's probably just going to twist some of the tops of those weeds up. We haven't had much luck with that. And then Sharpen's another product that can be used. And we've had some really good luck in helping desiccate some of our resistant weed issues, particularly things like glyphosate resistant mare's tail, and maybe help with some of the pigweed and ragweed species with Sharpen, and you can either use 1 or 2 ounces. And you can see some of the different pre-harvest intervals where they can go from anywhere from 3 days up to 14 days or 15 days. Now, when we talk about some of the harvest aids that we can use in soybeans, obviously we have those 6 different options. But one of the things you always want to consider if you're thinking about using a harvest aid in soybeans is making sure that you choose the right herbicide for the weeds that are present. So for example, you wouldn't use glyphosate if you had glyphosate-resistant mare's tail or water hemp to do for a desiccant. Something like gramoxone or a combination of gramoxone plus Sharpen would probably work. Additionally, as I mentioned, we have seen some resistance issues in water hemp that are resistant to the group 14s. Sharpen's a group 14 herbicide. So if that's the case, we wouldn't necessarily want to use that herbicide. Another thing to consider is really when we're using a harvest aid in soybeans, we're really looking at trying to desiccate the weeds, not necessarily the soybeans. And when these different desiccants can be applied is with things like glyphosate, AIM, and clarity would have to be when those soybeans are mature. And that basically means that there are no green, there's no green color in any of the pods that are out in the field. So again, waiting for those soybeans to be mature. When we look at things like gramoxone and Sharpen, it's a little bit wider window. We're looking at greater than 65% of the pods being mature, but we want that seed moisture to be less than 30% moisture. And in the case of Sharpen, you can also look at the field, and if you have 70% leaf drop, that might be a good time to actually use something like Sharpen if you're looking at desiccating some of the weeds in that soybean field. Another thing to consider is what the rotation restrictions are. So depending on what your rotation is, so for example, if you're gonna harvest your soybeans and plant wheat, one of the choices out of those 6 that you wouldn't want to use is Clarity. And that would be because we would see some injury on that wheat if we had used Clarity as our as our desiccant. With sugar beets and dry beans, there's some more restrictions, and we'll talk a little bit more about those when we talk about some of the dry bean desiccants. We have a lot of this information in our weed control guide, so if you're looking at some more information on those desiccants, please look at pages 113 and 114 in the 2022 weed control guide. Now, with our pre-harvest treatments and dry beans, those are definitely more common. I would say probably greater than 80% of our dry beans in Michigan are desiccated. And again, that's really to help with the weeds that interfere at harvest. And it also kind of helps with some of the unevenness in maturity of dry beans. And here are just a few pictures of some of the different options that we do have. And these are ones that were applied way too early, but just to show you the speed of quickness of how these work. We've probably had some of our better results when we've looked at some of the different tank mixes, and I'll show you that here. So in general, Sharpen and gramoxone have been our 2 go-to desiccants in dry beans. And again, that might be something to consider when we're talking about if you're thinking about doing it in soybeans. And in general, we've seen that 1 ounce of Sharpen is pretty similar to the 2 ounce rate of Sharpen. So depending on what you're trying to do, that has worked pretty well. And in general, we've done probably 8 to 10 years of research. And a lot of times if we use that lower rate of Sharpen and tank mix it with gramoxone and making sure that we have a methylated seed oil in there, we seem to improve the consistency of desiccation. And again, we've looked at several different varieties over several different environments. And one other thing is a lot of times we're looking at desiccating some of those weeds. Sharpen is a good desiccant for, again, some of the mare's tail or pigweed species, but we really need to have that gramoxone in there to help desiccate something like lamb's quarters. And you can see here that picture and what that looked like. And that would have been about 7 days after that application. Another thing, just to remind you of, there are some rotation restrictions. In particular, we've seen some issues if we've used the higher rate of Sharpen in those fall desiccants, particularly looking at dry beans. And you can see here with the rotation restrictions, this foreground, we had some reduced sugar beet stand, and the use rates really varies, or the amount of time needed. With Sharpen, it'd be 4 months for the rotation, 4 months for the rotation to sugar beets. And we want to make sure that we're not including the time when the ground is frozen in that count. So just keep that in mind, where it's a month longer if we're using that higher rate. And we have also seen that same issue with dry beans, and those rotation restrictions are very similar. So keep that in mind if you're going to be using Sharpen as a desiccant and you're going to be going to sugar beets or dry beans. Definitely use the 1 ounce rate and not the 2 ounce rate. Another thing that we're going to talk about a little bit is some of the fall applications that we can use. And what we can also do is, one of the bigger issues that we have is some of the horseweed populations. And you can see a field once it's harvested, a lot of times we see a lot of new emergence of horseweed or mare's tail that we need to take care of. And some of those fall treatments, again, can be used either prior to corn or soybeans, and that'll help reduce those populations in the spring. It also helps reduce some of the variability in the horseweed size if we have to go out there with a spring treatment. In many cases, we do have some later emerging mare's tail that can come up in the spring and through the summer. We're still going to want to make sure that we have a residual. And in some cases, we are going to need that spring burn down. So count on that, but we can definitely help. And you can see these pictures here. The top one would be with fall burn down. The bottom had a no fall burn down. And those burn downs will also help manage a lot of the winter annual weed species that are out there. In general, if we're looking at trying to manage mare's tail, we want to have one of these 3 herbicides in that mixture, whether it's 2,4-D ester or any of the 2,4-D products. Sharpen at 1 or 2 ounces, and dicamba can also be used as a fall treatment. And those treatments can be applied. Obviously, putting glyphosate in when those mixes are going to help control some of the winter annual weeds and some of those perennials like dandelion that can be out there. And those fall applications are probably one of our best ways to help manage things like dandelion instead of trying to wait until the spring. We also have several residual herbicides that we can add in there that can also enhance some of that fall burn down, but a lot of those residuals are not going to hold through to the spring to help control some of the different species, in particular glyphosate resistant mare's tail or horseweed. Another thing I want to mention is controlling weeds prior to planting wheat is also very important. Last year, we did a study where we looked at conventional tillage, no tillage with fall application burn down, and then also no tillage without a fall application. And one thing that we did see at the end of the season is that there was definitely a benefit to making sure that we had good weed control in the fall, particularly things that are going to be there after you harvest those soybeans and try to get that winter wheat crop in the ground. So what are some of those fall burn down herbicide options that we can actually apply prior to weed emergence? So we can either apply it prior to drilling that weed in the ground or making sure we get those applications on prior to the wheat emerging. Obviously, glyphosate is one of those key components where it'll control most winter annual, biennial, and perennial weeds, again, especially dandelion. One of the key misses that we do have is with horseweed or mare's tail because of that glyphosate resistance. Because of that, a lot of times we might be adding Sharpen in there. And again, we can use 1 or 2 ounces, and it's been very effective for horseweed control. In fact, this last year, we had a trial where we were looking at including that Sharpen in with the glyphosate. And because of the good wheat stand that we had, we were able to suppress a lot of the mare's tail that might have come up in the spring, just due from the competitive nature. So by getting that good start with the Sharpen in the fall, in that burn down, that definitely helped with our mare's tail control. Another option we have is germoxone that can be applied. It's not as effective as glyphosate. Again, it's going to be a burner, not going to really do a very good job on our perennials or biennials. It will control the horseweed or mare's tail. But if those plants get a little bit larger, it's going to be much more of a challenge. We also have the option of applying some of our wheat herbicides in the fall after the wheat has emerged. And that's really to control a lot of the winter annual weeds that might come up with winter wheat. Things like chickweed, also mare's tail, some of those. And generally, we're applying those herbicides when the wheat is at the 2 to 3 leaf stage. Again, controlling those winter annual weeds. And here's some of the work that we did this last year looking at chickweed control. This is a rating partway through the spring. And when we had a fall burn down or fall application, we definitely had much better chickweed control. One of the downfalls is with some of these post herbicide applications in the fall, they may not provide enough residual activity through the spring. So it's one of those things that we just need to keep an eye on. We're going to be doing quite a bit of fall herbicide work this year, looking at early planted versus late planted wheat. And some of the different choices we have are things like Husky, Talonor, or Culex, which would be very good for our controlling some of that emerged horseweed, particularly when that wheat has emerged. Another area where we've seen some huge benefits is in controlling some of the winter annual grasses. Particularly with windgrass, fall applications have worked extremely well. We've had very good annual bluegrass control. That has become much more of a challenge. And we've also seen some really good rough stalk bluegrass control. So it's just one of those things to keep in mind. Just to show you a quick application or comparison, this is windgrass control with Osprey. This would be a fall application. That picture on the right-hand side is what that field looked like if we didn't apply it in the fall. or no herbicide application, and this is with spring apps. We had pretty good control, but not as good as what we had in the fall. So again, these were taken at the same time. And again, we've had very good luck with annual bluegrass with either using Osprey or PowerFlex, or if we have rough stock bluegrass, the Osprey works best. Another benefit to some of those fall post applications is being able to establish red clover. And you can just tell the difference here between an application of Husky in the fall versus the spring, if you're going to be doing some frost seeding. But we can see maybe a little bit of injury from those Husky applications. So we do have our recommendations, and there are some of these products that we can apply in the fall and then still frost seed red clover. So things like Affinity Broad Spec, Husky, Clarity, MCPA, Axial Bold. Some of the other ones, we know we have some issues with establishment and with Culex, but and then maybe a little bit of reduced stand with things like Osprey and PowerFlex. So when can you make those applications? Generally, we'll make those applications anytime from late October through mid-November. So that's kind of the time frame that we're usually looking at. And just to give you a few more resources, again, a lot of the information I just covered is in the MSU Weed Control Guide. You can find that on our website, msuweeds.com. We have a lot of our different fact sheets listed on there and also in the back of the Weed Control Guide. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paul again, and I'll be around to answer any questions.
So Christy, have you had a chance to filter through some of the questions?
Sure. I can kind of just go through them fairly quickly, Paul. That works pretty well.
That works the best.
Okay. So the first question, I've had a few calls lately asking about DFOL, if it can be used on, as a soybean harvest aid. It is labeled that sodium chlorate. There is a 7-day pre-harvest interval. I will tell you that I have not looked at it, so I really don't have any good practical knowledge on how well that would work. So it is something that somebody could try, but I've never seen it, so I wouldn't be able to give you any practical information on that. There's another question. If we use desiccants, are weed seeds going to have full viability? Many of the weed seeds out there are fully mature, so those ones will have full viability. We have some that are at various stages. The ones that are kind of still immature, depending on the species, some of them will be basically non-viable. If they are close to being mature, certain species will continue on with maturity even after desiccant treatment. So it really depends on the species, but I would say that a majority of our weeds that have escaped have some mature seeds right now. The next question, fall herbicide applications or tillage, what is the best way to put a field to bed? A lot of it depends on what your goals are. If you are trying to maintain a no-till situation, we can do a pretty good job with a lot of those fall herbicide applications, particularly trying to clean up some of those perennial weeds and things like mare's tail in the fall. And we've had some really good luck with tillage as far as being able to decrease mare's tail populations because those seeds are so small to bury. And once they're buried, they're going to have a hard time coming up the next season. So it just really, depends on what your conservation goals are as far as if you want to maintain a no tillage situation or not. Again, a lot of those fall applications will help with some of those perennial weeds because those herbicides will be moving to the roots. The next question, I've heard nutsedge has become fairly herbicide resistant, even with specific brands that target them and different modes of action. Any advice on this? Nutsedge is a very difficult weed, and it's one of those ones that needs constant attack. I would say the best herbicide that we've seen with nutsedge is permit, and that can be used in corn and it can be used in dry beans. Other than that, many of the other herbicides are just fair and we need multiple applications. So that's kind of where we're at on that. It's just been it's a very difficult weed and it just needs continuous management. The next question, after cutting soybeans and cutting thistles off, you till and plant wheat. After thistles reemerge in the wheat, can you use stinger in the fall to kill the thistles? You can use Stinger after the wheat has 3 leaves. As far as killing the thistles, a lot of those reserves are probably still going to be going towards the top, so the Stinger's probably not going to get all the way through the rootstock. So you're probably still going to see some emergence in the spring. So it may be best to go ahead and wait and do a spring application of Stinger to manage those thistles, just to make sure you get most of those thistles plants emerging. And then the final question, would you suggest that soybean fields with lots of weed escapes be rotated to corn in 2023 instead of the potential back-to-back soybeans to clean up weeds that emerge in the 2022 season? I think it really depends on what your goals are. If you know what weeds you have, we do have some fairly good programs in soybeans, depending on the soybean traits that are out there that we can use. And many of those herbicides can be used, that can be used in corn now can be used in soybeans, depending on those herbicide resistant traits. Rotating to corn gives us a few more options, which can be helpful for some of those species. And in general, we do see some benefits, not only from a weed control standpoint, but probably a yield standpoint, if we can rotate to another crop. I know in certain situations, you can't always rotate to corn. So I guess it really just depends, but just make sure you know what those weeds are that you're trying to manage in those fields. And I don't know if there's, let's see, there's one other question. I'm seeing more and more velvet leaf escapes. So as we prepare for next season, what would you recommend? Probably the biggest issue that we have is some of those late season velvet leaf. There are some chemistries that will control velvet leaf very effectively post-emergence. And those are the ones that would have the active ingredients that are in Resource and also in Cadet. So there's some Anthem herbicide. It's a premix that can be applied. I think the key thing is making sure that we're aware that it's coming. And then if you have those escapes, getting out there early enough to make sure that you're getting those under control. So with that, we'll turn it over to Paul. I think we
okay. Thanks, Christy. I think that's all the questions. I see Chris Stefanzo's on, and I think Marty Childers is still on. So Chris, is there anything you'd like to add from an insect standpoint?
Not really. It's been pretty quiet, and I've kind of switched over to teaching. So basically there hasn't been much, or I think I would have heard about it.
Okay, very good. Marty?
There's not really too much to add either on the pathology side of things. I guess, it's always a good time to scout and be aware of what disease issues are out there in soybeans, being aware of, potentially white mold, maybe in your fields for management next year and the years following. Obviously, there's a little bit more tar spot increasing with the moisture that we're finally getting in some areas. But obviously, it's very, very late now and certainly not worth spraying at this point in time. So that's all I have.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Phil, is there anything to add?
Paul, I think it's been a great season. We've had terrific information. I think that there's been some excellent participation by producers and agribusiness personnel. And I want to especially thank every specialist and every educator that's participated with our program this year. I think it's been a rousing success. So one more in the books. And
yeah, that's I guess that's the way to put it. So
go onward and forward.
Yeah. We'll look forward to seeing everyone again next year, and have a good week. Have a good rest of the year, and go green.
Go white.